Okay, good afternoon. Want to respect everyone's time and start promptly, so we'll kick things off. Good afternoon. I'm Kim Eberhard. I can't even say my name today. That's the kind of we're going to talk about burnout. Kim Eberhard. Kim Eberhard. I am the president of PRSA Detroit. Want to thank everyone for joining us today. We are so excited to be presenting this program. I will just share a couple high-level kind of housekeeping items, and then we will dive right in. So as you may have noticed, if everyone has been kind of paying attention to PRSA and what we've been doing, we are focused on providing programming throughout this time that is consistently highlighting opportunities. And as we all kind of are in a challenging time and figuring out the best way to kind of manage our current work and home lives, we have kind of built a robust set of programs for PRSA Detroit, and this is amongst them. I hope you will all also save your calendar or save on your calendar next week. August 19th from 12:30 to 1:30, we have another program on diversity, equity, and inclusion in communication. So I encourage you to follow our social channels or on their website. That's a partner program with IABC Detroit. So we're really looking forward to a great and robust discussion there. In terms of today, certainly encourage you all, we're going to have a great discussion led by Janet, and encourage you all to share your thoughts on the PRSA social channels. You can use the hashtag PRSA Detroit. So welcome you to add your thoughts and feedback in real time. Also, just from a housekeeping perspective, if you have questions for Janet, sorry, just one second. If you have questions for Janet, I ask you to add those in on the chat function. And Jamie Morris, who is a PRSA Detroit member, will be actively monitoring those and filtering the questions at the end of the presentation. So with that, I will hand it over to Janet. Let me give you a little bit, just kind of background on Janet. So she is the founder of True Depth. She has built a successful career by, helping others create their own success stories as individual executives, entrepreneurial startups, and large-scale corporations. She's the founder of True Depth and Novi, an executive coaching and management consulting firm specializing in working with business owners and senior leaders in the technology, manufacturing, and professional services areas. Prior to launching True Depth, Janet served as the COO for technology consulting firm Red Level, where she oversaw the company's marketing, communications, and HR initiatives, and provided strategic guidance to the CEO and managed daily business operations. She joined Red Level following a 14-year track record of success as co-founder, president, and co-CEO of Airfoil, a name that we're all familiar with here, a marketing and public relations firm focused on the technology sector. At Airfoil, she was instrumental in guiding the company to a dominant position within its niche and spearheading its expansion into Silicon Valley and leading the company from startup stage to a national top-ranked technology marketing agency. She earned her bachelor's degree and master's degree in organizational communication from Michigan University, that is. And Janet's also an executive producer of the annual TEDx Detroit, drawing 3,000 attendees to an incredible Detroit location each year. So she's also current and active long-term member of PRSA's Counselors Academy. And she's been in the Novi Rotary since the summer of 2017, and she makes her home in Northville. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Janet Tyler, and take it away, Janet.
Thank you so much, Kim, and thank you, PRSA Detroit, for having me today to talk all about a topic that is probably near and dear to our hearts after 4 to 5 months of living in a global pandemic, and that is burnout. So we're going to be talking today all about the identification, hopefully the prevention, and then most importantly, the recovery of burnout, not just in yourself, but also in how you work and relate to others in the workplace, or possibly even someone that you love that you do not work with that may be suffering from burnout as well. So I appreciate the time today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I do have a PowerPoint prepared for today as a typical communicator. I love PowerPoint. Can everybody see that? I'm going to assume yes. Okay, so before I tell this story to kind of kick us off, I do want to let all of you know, thank you so much for that introduction, Kim. But the two things that I want you all to kind of take away with about me is that I am one of you. I come from a 20-year career in public relations and marketing communications. I do understand your world. I consider, all of you part of my tribe, and I do understand the stress and the pressure, but also the joy and the satisfaction that comes from a career in PR. I also would like for you to know that I am still very much a work in progress. I refer to myself jokingly, but maybe somewhat realistically, as a PR person in recovery. I just had my 50th birthday a few weeks ago, and I'm in the midst of a career change or an evolution. And it's exciting time, but also still scary. But I'm glad to be here today to share a little bit of my story and talk a little bit about burnout with each of you. So before I tell this story, I do want you to know that I have the full support of my family and especially my daughter, because we believe that if what I learned through my experience helps one person, then it is completely worth sharing. And this would probably be around early of 2014. This was not a sound I would ever think to imagine that would occur in my home, and it was the sound of handcuffs being clasped together in my foyer. Really could not have been further from my worst nightmare. The person being handcuffed was my 16-year-old daughter. I was tired that night. I was time zone confused. I was stressed. And at least, that's what I was telling myself. That was the story I was telling myself that evening. I had traveled out of office to San Francisco for a huge new business trip that week before. Obviously, I was an agency PR person at that time. And I was negotiating a renewal with our largest account. I was working on our agency's strategic plan. There's 1,000 reasons, 1,000 things that were going on in my head. Unfortunately, what started off as a small, normal argument between a mother and a 16-year-old daughter developed into something that became physical over something as simple as doing the dishes. Before I knew it, World War III had broken out and we were in a full-blown physical altercation. I lost it that night, 100%. I recognize my daughter wasn't completely correct in her behavior that night either, but I'm the parent, I'm the leader of of my household, and I was out of control that night. Very atypical me. For the next 3 days, while she was sitting in Detroit Wayne County Juvenile Correctional Facility, we were working with attorneys, getting her first hearing to get her out. And yes, I still worked that week. I remember distinctly sitting in the courthouse waiting for her for something to happen in the process, and being on my phone for work. And why was that? I think now with, 6, 7 years in retrospect, it was because work was my safe place. I really did feel connected there. But what began to happen and unravel after that time is probably not the best of the story, in that work also did not become my safe space. And many of you can probably relate. I had 1,000 things going on, just like all of us do, right? My marriage, my children, I wasn't sleeping good, taking everything very seriously, like losing an account. I was having quality issues in my work, and I really wasn't feeling very connected or like I was contributing in my role. And that is a very, very scary place to be for someone who is a high performer, and what I thought was, a great worker, a great employee, even if it was at that point, my own company. So, I'm going through hell, but what do? I go out to the internet, to find some inspiration. There's got to be something I can do. I absolutely recognize that my tank was out of gas, but for whatever reason, I was still trying to drive, but had no gas. So, Winston Churchill says, hey, if you're going through hell, keep going. Oprah, I still do not understand this quote. I've read it 1,000 times. Challenges are gifts that force us to search a new center of gravity. Don't fight them, just find a new way to stand. I had that quote on my wall for a little while, trying to see if I could find a new way to stand to get through this. Or then you have someone like Gary Vaynerchuk, and many of you probably know him and follow him. His quote for me was, "Unless you're running fast, you're dead." None of these, obviously quotes were very helpful for me at that time, and they wouldn't be helpful for anyone who was really suffering burnout. And what becomes of a broken heart and a broken mind? You should know my daughter is fine now. She's healthy and thriving. But for me, I think I really did break my mind that night. And was really unable to recover from both the crush of the personal things that were going on in my life, and having a very busy and successful business at that time. And it literally just resulted in complete and utter burnout, which meant it was time for me to move on and evolve my career and try something new after a long and somewhat forced period of rest. So, I think that where I'd like to start today is like, what are the differences between stress versus burnout? I think a lot of us kind of interchangeably use stress and burnout similarly. Now, as a certified and credentialed executive coach with hundreds of hours of training and hundreds of hours of training executives at not just tech companies, but from companies all over the world, I know that stress and burnout are two very different things. Stress is a very temporary pressure, whereas burnout is after long periods of sustained stress continued over a long period of time, where you're emitting all that, cortisol all the time. Challenges begin to feel insurmountable. And the key difference is, if you look at, stress is like where, oh, I'm going to over engage, I'm going to try to fix this, I'm stressed, so I'm going to try to control everything. Whereas burnout becomes more about disengagement, where it's just literally removing yourself, if not physically, sometimes emotionally or mentally, from a situation. When you're stressed, emotions are very overreacted and heightened. Burnout looks like emotions are blunted. And again, you can tell yourself, oh, for someone who usually very much cares about outcomes and process, when you're really burned out, your emotions just become very blunted, and you're more indifferent than maybe you would know yourself to normally be. Stress is more about just a temporary loss of energy, whereas burnout is loss of ideas, motivation, and sometimes, even in my case, a loss of hope, and probably some clinical depression. Maybe I'm pulling back the veil here of a little bit of the stigma around mental health and wellness in our society. Stress definitely leads to anxiety disorders. Come to find out now, after years of studying what the heck happened to me, I understand that now, that the stress that I was under, and feeling like I'm a high performer and that I could handle all of this stress over a 14-year period, really probably led to the burnout, right? Which was complete detachment, and yes, very much so depression. Stress, you've all heard about cortisol. You get that belly ring, the fat around your belly. Your heart can suffer, sometimes headaches or sleep. But with burnout, the stress is, yes, there are stressors there that lead to all of those side effects, but the primary damage is much more emotional. And yes, stress can kill you prematurely, but burnout really can sometimes make your life not feel like it's worth living. So since this has happened to me, I am on a one-woman charge to prevent this from happening to other PR professionals, because it is a huge impact to our society, to healthcare spending in the US. It's about $190 billion a year. You may say, so what? I don't understand what that means. In your company, the people that you work with, it could mean low productivity, poor teamwork, physical health issues, completely unengaged employees. And in this time of this pandemic, when we're all having to over-index on being engaged, it would be very, very normal that at some point we may not be able to sustain this level of energy, and something may have to change in your life or in your company, in the way that you work. So what does, burnout possibly look like for you? Well, in my case, definitely a loss of personal income. Maybe you could lose clients or employees, a complete inability to work, anxiety, interpersonal conflicts, physical health issues. I mean, the list just goes on and on. What that looks like for all of us, just literally in society, is our kids, our doctors, our lawyers, air traffic controllers. Well, maybe less so today. There are probably not that many planes in the air, but normally nurses, teachers, people who are in charge of our finance and our health are all feeling, at some points in their career, stress for sure. But those that are feeling burned out may really be having issues in delivering a great product or service or prescription to us on the end user side. So when I was going through kind of my, recovery of coming out of this burnout, I was sitting in a class for my son. It was an active shooter training for children, and they used the, freeze, fight, or flight kind of analogy when there is an active shooter, and the way that they were going to be training the children, which was so upsetting anyway. But as I was going through this, I was kind of thinking about, that would be kind of interesting to look at burnout through this lens. And because I'm not a trained psychologist, I decided to kind of use the animal kingdom here to kind of carry this analogy. So if you wouldn't mind staying with me for a few moments through this analogy, I would appreciate it. So freezing, and so you could kind of think of yourself, but also I encourage you when I'm going through these three, areas, to think about not just yourself, but maybe the people you're working with. Maybe you've noticed someone who was a high performer for years that you've worked with is suddenly struggling. And maybe it's because of the pandemic. Maybe it's because of all of the change. There's a lot of reasons, but you can kind of start to think about, and I don't want you to pretend that you're a doctor or you're diagnosing, but I do want you to kind of think about, are some of these attributes either for you or those colleagues or possibly someone you love, maybe your spouse. So what freezing looks like in burnout is, feeling kind of sick or tired on the regular, consistently missing deadlines, poor quality when deadlines are met. Self-care is typically very lacking. So you may see things like weight gain or letting go of, I don't know, if this person maybe loves to get their nails done and then suddenly is no longer doing that, or they like to play tennis and now you're noticing, wow, they really are not doing that. They definitely have a tendency, because they're frozen, right? Like this Arctic bunny, that they become kind of stuck. Like they realize, or they think they're realizing, I can't go anywhere. I'm stuck here. This is the rest of my career. I have to stay in this job. It's the devil I know. At least I know something, right? And sometimes even just an inability to rally, where they or you may be communicating, yes, I'm feeling great. And then a week later, they're right back to where they started. It's very difficult to kind of bring back up that energy to rally. Fighting in burnout looks very different. This is, when you or someone that you work with is very cynical of the organization. They have lost all trust in the people and or the decisions that the company is making, and just honestly quite irritable. I look back at that time in my life when I was going through, what I think was a pretty severe case of burnout, and I was really irritable during that time. It was very, very unlike me. I am not normally predisposed to being irritable, but I was, I could come up with a word that starts with B, at least once a day to someone, which was very, very unlike me. Lots of, conflict happening. This thinking of like, yeah, I'm going to fight harder. I'm going to work harder. I'm going to push through this. I'm going to be like Gary Vaynerchuk. If you're not moving fast, then you're dead. So I got to keep working harder. They can be very disruptive. It's got to be their way or the highway. And honestly, quite culturally, they can really be seen as kind of toxic. Now, flight looks very different in burnout. And you could have multiple symptoms right across any of these, but maybe inconsistency. So you're working really hard, super engaged one day, but then the next day you're just feeling out of it. I remember many times kind of being in a conference room with people and feeling like I was kind of floating above it. Like I was just so checked out, not really engaged in the work all that much. And it was very inconsistent. Oftentimes just flighting, meaning withdrawal or completely disengaged. In this kind of category of burnout, you'll see increased drug and or alcohol use just to escape. So literally flighting out of the situation. This is where, and as some of you are feeling a little bit of crispiness around the edges, a little bit of burnout maybe, this is where your confidence really starts to erode. And you kind of lose track of like what your strengths are. Somebody asks you, hey, Susie, what are you good at? She would have a really difficult time possibly answering. And just an inability to commit to things. You know, hey, we're going to meet at this time. They may not show up, completely unlike them. Or, oh, I don't know if I can do it at that time. I'll let you know. Trying to kick the can a little bit. That's definitely flight. You know, and it's all varying degrees. At any given time, some of us could have 3 or 4 of these and not be burned out, right? That's just a time and place kind of situation. This is typically over a duration, months of, you know, being in a very stressful state and not taking care of yourself in stress can lead to burnout, right? So these are like kind of varying degrees. Some of the absolute common mistakes, and now as an executive coach, I'm coaching at Salesforce and Facebook and Deloitte. I'm seeing some of these common mistakes somewhat over and over again. And that is, you know, the high performer, and I know for sure that this was me. I am not susceptible to burnout. I'm special. I'm an owner. I don't know what I was telling myself. The story was completely inaccurate. But that I could push or just work through burnout. Yeah, I'm a little burned out. That's okay. I'm gonna keep going. Some of us may be misinterpreting, oh, and I realize I think I have a typo here, a colleague or a peer as a low performer. We may just like say, oh, yep, they suck at their job, but really they're feeling just burned out. It's not that they, you know, maybe they were promoted or given a lot of extra work because they were a star player. They may be really just burned out. Some people think, oh, I'll just take a week off and come back and hit it hard again and it'll cure my burnout. Or they may confuse stress with burnout. So hopefully you know that none of these things really work. The reality is, and I know this for a fact, is that only you, I'm going to be like Smokey the Bear, can prevent burnout. And it is 100% in charge. You are in charge of this. I think maybe if I think back, was I waiting for someone to tell me, hey, Janet, you should take a break, or hey, Janet, don't think so much about this, or whatever. That didn't happen, right? It was really up to me to make that decision of putting those boundaries down and saying I was not going to let myself burn out. Here are just a few prevention tips for burnout. And because we are in this Zoom world now, sometimes what's happening is I'm noting in a lot of companies and particularly agencies that I'm working with is that there's this like excessive collaboration happening. When the pandemic first hit, absolutely, we were doing, you know, lots of Zoom calls, lots of happy hours, lots of, you know, really trying to create team and connections and bonding. But I would argue, you know, sometimes for making even decisions or to move the ball forward, we have a lot of unnecessary meetings and are maybe have moved towards a state of over collaboration. Not always, but it might be something to consider. Setting clear expectations for both yourself and the team. And this is super hard to do if you are a high performer and you're used to being able to run really fast over long periods of time. When you are kind of feeling unable to do that, it's really difficult to not overcommit and say, you know, gosh, even though a year ago I could have done that, I could have committed to that product launch, I could have committed to putting my child through school, I could have committed to, you know, all of these things. Sometimes you have to be able to say that was then, what is now, right? And I think we lose track of that. You know, stop this urge. You know, we all have those high performer people that we work with, even if they don't report to you. And we have this urge to say, oh my gosh, you know, Susie can do it. She's great. Let her pick it up. You know, we have to really, really stop that urge and protect those people. I'm not saying don't give them work, but I'm saying to really consider the fact that burnout is real. And if when they're done, they may be done. And and it is very true in PR. We're in a very high pressure job, you know, and it does and can result not just from stress, but from burnout. And I think we have a tendency to overload the people who can step up and do the work. Begin to talk about burnout openly with your team or your people or your agency or your company, whatever that is. You know, start to really put it out there. Hey, I attended this session through PRSA on burnout, and you know, gosh, I think we might be headed down the wrong path here on this initiative or this decision or policy that we're making. Really put it out on the table, because I think, you know, a lot of ego sometimes is involved with burnout, like, oh, I can handle it. try to prevent or to stop that if you can. And yes, I have to say it, even though I am now a qualified coach, you know, if you have to bring in an outside coach to help facilitate some of this dialogue, this seminar that I'm doing is typically about 2 hours. And I do it with all kinds of companies to come in and help put these things on the table. There are lots of assessments. One is free. You all can go and do this now. It's on the bottom left here of my slide. It's called the VIA Institute on Character. It will give you your strengths. It doesn't necessarily mean that just because you know your strengths, you're not going to burn out, but it means, you know, if you knew your top 3 to 5 strengths, what this survey calls your signature strengths, what can you do? How can you use those strengths to prevent burnout in yourself? Simple Google search. It's a really good assessment tool, and it's free. So I give that to you today if you haven't already done that. There's all kinds of other assessments. I'm certified in both DISC and emotional intelligence that will absolutely tell you if you are somewhat predisposed to burning out. Come to find out, after talking to doctors and trying to figure out what was going on with me, my personality type, I'm very much a type A, have some perfectionistic tendencies, not always, you know, kind of led me almost like if you have a hereditary or a genetic factor in your health, like your mother has high cholesterol, so you may have high cholesterol. Come to find out, I had some personality attributes that predisposed me, made me great at my job, but also predisposed me to burnout. So just knowing that, I think would be very, very helpful for all of you to know that. Maslach, M-A-S-L-A-C-H, has an actual assessment around burnout. And they look at these 6 things that are, they call the areas of work life, which include workload, control, reward, community, fairness, and values. Come to find out, this may be surprising, but a perceived lack of fairness in the organization, meaning why does this person get to work 3 days a week and none of the others get to work 3 days a week, or whatever that perceived lack of fairness is, can really result in a potential for high burnout. If you're really perceiving a lack of fairness in your job, that could be an issue. But what I like about this assessment is not just the fact that you take the, you know, you answer all the questions and it tells you, you know, oh, you may be burned out or you're not burned out or whatever. It also looks at the job fit. Meaning, you know, when you look at all of these things, and if you're working, you know, with a coach or whoever, counselor or a career counselor, sometimes we have a tendency sometimes to gravitate towards a job we think we really want. Then you get in it, and 10 years later, you realize, gosh, you know what? I don't know for sure if this is the job for me. It's really difficult to take a step back, both financially, title, or whatever it is, and to make a career change, which is, believe me, I'm doing it right now. It isn't easy, but I would argue I'm a much better person and less stressed and less burned out for making that change. But I'm not diminishing how difficult it is. But this is a really good assessment that kind of helps look at that. But rebounding from burnout or even preventing it, you know, requires 3 things, which are kind of like no-brainers. But the Harvard Business Review published an article on these 3 things, and I was like, yeah, duh. Replenishing lost resources, avoiding further resource depletion, and finding or creating resource-rich conditions going forward. So I'm going to try to take you through what I'm calling 10 quick tips to really drive recovery. I've kind of gone through all the symptoms, and some of you are like, yep, I'm absolutely burned out. Janet's nailed it. Some of you are like, yeah, you know what? I have some signs of stress. I might need to do some intervention to make sure that my long-term stress does not turn into burnout, right? It's kind of like I don't know. When I say turn into, it sounds like you become a zombie or you become someone different, but that is really how it can work. So if you look at those 3 things, you may be thinking, well, gosh, that's easy. Well, the reality is it's not easy. In fact, it's very, very difficult to recover from burnout. And I would argue once you've crossed over into that chasm, the studies are showing that sometimes true recovery from burnout can take up to 2 years to really, truly recover, and reconnect with yourself. And that's, for me, having been in business, owned an agency, and not really understanding that, I think is just so critical. I kind of maybe was one of those people, I don't want to say that I never said this out loud, like burnout is for wimps, but maybe I might have been predisposed to that mentality. It's not easy. It can be done. And here are some things, some are going to be much more obvious than others. I'm going to just share, what I call like a top 10 burnout busters list for all of you. So the first one, and for those of you that are in an agency, this should be relatively, I don't want to say simple, because no one, as I recall, loved to track time for those that did work in an agency. But, if you think back to go to your calendar and look at maybe the last 25 meetings that you had, interfaces with colleagues and clients. And for each of those meetings, record what you were doing, who you were with, how you felt in that meeting, and how valuable that activity was. And so, you may say, well, gosh, I really love my team morning huddle. I feel energized. I love those meetings. I laugh a lot, or you may have meetings with, I don't know, maybe it's a dotted line supervisor, where every time you meet with this person, you're sad, angry, confused. It will really help provide some insight. And I'm not saying that you can't avoid working with that dotted line supervisor, but it means that you might need to be in a really good mental place to take on that meeting, meaning that you've rested. Maybe you're scheduling that meeting in the morning or whenever you're feeling freshest, could be a really good way to look at that. And I promise you, if you do this, you may really see some interesting trends. And of course, skate to where the puck is. For the things that you are loving to do and that make you feel energized, obviously you want to try to do more of that. And the things that, pardon my French, that suck, do less of those if you can, or move them to a time slot in your day when you are typically a bit more higher performing. Number two, this will surprise a lot of you, but studies show doing the work. So for those of you that have ascended into some level of leadership land, and whatever that means in your organization or in your company culture, you're dealing with people problems and, client issues and, policy stuff. Sometimes going back in and getting your hands dirty to, draft a news release or call a member of the media or whatever it is that makes you feel connected to your work again, can be super valuable. For some people who have crossed over and are maybe feeling a little too burned out, this can be challenging, but I promise you it's very beneficial. So if this was a group of plumbers, I would say go plumb something, or fix an electrical outlet if you're an electrician, kind of get back to like, why did you start this career? Get back in touch with the work. Number three, and this does get into, the career change, the anticipation and the stress of having to think about making a change or recognizing that you're unhappy in your career is super challenging. And I love this quote by James. It's an artist that I really love. And, it says, if I hadn't seen such riches, I could live with being poor. And, when you're used to living on a certain level of income and then you decide to make a change, and sometimes there's sacrifice, not always, financially, that can really be debilitating. And some of us are just staying in the job because whatever, we make I'm making up a number, $85,000 a year, and I can't live on a penny less. And the reality is you can. If I can do it, anybody can do it. But it's super, super difficult to do. And I think if you bring in your tribe, your spouse, your parents, whoever those people are, and start to talk about that and really build a plan. And in fact, many people that I'm working with now have taken some financial hits through the pandemic, and they're kind of realizing, wow, I don't really need to get my nails done twice a month, or I don't really need, obviously none of us have had our hair done in months or whatever. So really try to face down those fears and say, what would it be like? And start drastically. Start with a $30,000 pay cut. What would that look like, or whatever, and then really start to get realistic with whatever that is. But really facing down the potential of what that could look like, I think is really good. For me, this one was huge. I had to do a ton of work on this, and it was really about strengthening my identity outside of my job. And for those of you that worked at the agency with me, I mean, you know that like it was very difficult for me to separate my work and my family and myself. Many of you probably have already mastered this. I might just be late to the game, but things like having hobbies. And for me, it was I picked up photography. I'm not awesome, but I love taking classes and I love the craft. Really focusing on the joyful part of family. I know travel is a little bit more difficult, but traveling just for fun. And yes, maybe even some different kind of work could be a way to strengthen your identity outside of work. Anything spiritual, kind of, again, bolstering that outside of work identity. I'd really lost track of my faith because I was working so hard for so long. I think that's also a way to strengthen your identity outside of your job. And this is so, so important. And if you were to just take on your notebook, for those of you that are taking notes, what is your identity outside of your job? And hopefully it's more than, husband, parent, really encourage you to think much broader and a little more deeper on, your identity outside of your job. If your job went away tomorrow, what would that look like? And because my job was such a strong part of my identity, it was really difficult for me to think about it not being there, right? And then, interesting stuff. What looks good? What looks cool? Oh gosh, I really, I've always wanted to learn how to tinker with an old car or whatever that is. Exploring things that might be interesting to you. Would strongly encourage this. Number 5, again, this is obvious. I'm not going to spend a ton of time here, but music. And some of us, could be podcast. It could be, some derivative of, really feeding the soul. Reading. When I was really in a bad state of burnout, I had a difficult time. Not even just reading business books, but even like reading a novel was almost impossible. I mean, it took me a long time before I could really sit and be present with a good book. And so, feeding that soul with those kinds of things particularly in the arts category is very important. Some of us may actually miss that commute to work when we would listen to our favorite podcast or music. You can still do that. Just because you're working from home doesn't mean that you have to let that go. One of the other things that I did in my recovery is I joined my local Rotary Club. I had no idea what a Rotary Club did, by the way. It's awesome. I love it. I'm a youth services volunteer, and we are doing some incredible work in our local community and in our global community. And it has been, a huge part for me of understanding, wow, when you're feeling that stress and burnout, it's like, I cannot possibly think about helping someone else. I can barely help myself, right? But when pushed, I guarantee you the rewards of this, and also recognizing, my God, I have it really good. And for me and my daughter in particular, as we kind of went through our journey to repair and heal our relationship, doing volunteer work together was a big piece of that, because we saw children and families and parents, that had way less than us, that were thriving and doing more than just getting by. Obviously, prioritizing sleep, I almost want to yell this, like, literally just go to bed. You'll feel so much better if you are able to get some sleep. It's so important. And there's so much, even more so than in 2013 and 14, when I was kind of really going through the hellish part of this. There's just so much material on, darkening your room and preparing your ritual and all of that. But I really guarantee you, at that time, even 6 months prior, I was traveling a lot, doing even global travel, to China and London. And, my sleep schedule was a hot mess. So I really recommend you try to, rein that in and protect that, 7 to 8 hours of sleep every night. One thing that is going to be my gift to you today, and you can use this in your organizations, just use it at will, is to appoint a burnout buddy. And so you'll see a lot of the things that I've talked about here are in this letter. And essentially, you would be saying to a colleague or maybe a spouse, hey, because this is the deal. when you're feeling burned out, now maybe you have this intervention of sitting through this webinar, and if so, and you're able to self-diagnose yourself, like awesome. But if you're suffering and unable to identify, like, what's happening to me, why do I feel this way, you can sometimes empower, kind of tongue-in-cheek, a colleague or a coworker and say, hey, Susie, will you be my burnout buddy? Here's all the things from this webinar I attended. And I do this in my workshops with people. People take it very seriously. And it literally is, Janet Tyler, hereby appoint Susie to be my burnout buddy. If you see me having, more than I should, 3 or more of these areas, it means that there's a sign I may be burning out again. And I actually have a burnout buddy now in my life that I rely on heavily so that I never succumb to what I went through again. And I promise I do not think I will, based on the way that I make my decisions and run my current business. It's very, very different now for me. But I give this to you as a gift, and I'll tell you how to get it at the end of the webinar. And then, take a vacation. And I know it's a bummer. We've got a pandemic. It sucks. We can't go anywhere. If we can, we have to drive, and maybe it's camping. I did a vacation last week, just local. Some of you will be doing a staycation. It really does help. If you have not taken a vacation this year, or you've been postponing due to COVID or due to the pandemic, you must take a break. And I don't mean a 2-day break. I mean like a week. You need time to bring that cortisol down, bring that brain energy way down, whatever that looks like, where you are just literally not working or doing a minimal amount of work. Obviously, I'm not even going to go into this diet and exercise. I myself have gained a few COVID pounds, but it's an ever evolving journey, I'm sure, for all of us as well. But that's a key part of preventing burnout is diet and exercise. We're going to open it up for Q&A, and I really would love for all of you to ask as many questions here, because I'd love to use this extra 15 minutes that we have to talk about anything that's on your mind or questions. We have Jamie on the line who will help us in the chat to do that. But before we get into that, so I'm opening up for questions now. I do just want to say heart to heart, because this is a tribe of public relations people who I hold very dear and near to my heart, is, change is scary, whatever that change is for you. Sometimes the change could just be saying no. And when you've kind of built your life around being the yes person, the type A, let's go, it's very, very difficult to make that change, especially if you feel pride in being that hard worker or being known as that workhorse. It's a very, very difficult and delicate shift that needs to be made. It can happen, I promise you. And for me, I decided, and this actually happened, with a therapist, to kind of develop this manifesto as part of my recovery, where I am not looking to Oprah or Gary Vaynerchuk to tell me what to do. I'm looking at my own self. Who am I? Who is Janet? And I think that if all of you could really ask that question. And so for me, this just is something that poured out of me. It's actually right above my monitor here in my home office, repeated exactly as this. And one of those is, I take care of myself first. I am still a powerhouse. I trust the ability that I have to provide for my family, although it may not be what it was. That's okay. I feel that my life has meaning and purpose, and that my talents can bring me joy and happiness, right? And, this is pretty much how the name of my new company came to be, because it was, that I really truly feel I've found my calling to help others like you who may be suffering. And for that, I'm sorry, but let's work on, not suffering and thriving again, because I know that you can all do that. And for me, it's a little bit of Rotary, it's a little bit of TEDx, it's my business, it's my family, my husband, fishing. Janet is fishing. I love to fish. Who knew? But those are the things that, make a well-rounded individual. And I encourage you all to really work on yourselves a little bit here. We have, 5 months left in the year. You have plenty of time to head into 2021 thriving. If you are interested, I do have a leadership academy coming up starting mid-September. The website is thinkbiggerleadbetter.com. Feel free to check that out. I'm co-leading that with another PR person, although we are targeting all kinds of business professionals for this academy. This is our 4th class coming in the fall. So if you send me an email, I will email you back a free PDF of the Burnout Buddy Agreement. I'd love to see you institute it. And for those of you who want to take on the challenge of developing your own personal manifesto, go for it. And if you want to be held accountable, email it to me and I'd love to take a look and just get to know you all a little bit better. So with that, I'm going to turn it over for Q&A.
Janet, thank you so much. I think a lot of the things that you said today really resonated with me personally, and I think everybody in the chat. We've got some questions that have come in. Megan is wondering, how can you address burnout as an organization? Maybe not as an individual, but is there anything the organization can do to help alleviate burnout?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is really encouraging people to have and develop their own identities outside of work, but most importantly, it's normalizing it, right? So if you were to ask the question, hey, how do we make sure the team doesn't burn out? We've just done this massive product launch and we've been running 60, 70 hours a week, and everything kind of goes through these highs and lows. I think what happens on some super high performing teams is it's all up here. There's no downtime. And so you as the leader, if you're the leader of your group, have to create and sometimes force downtime. Like, oh, here's a window. There's no product launches. There's no major news announcement. Let's just take a breather for 4 days or 5 days or whatever that is and give people permission, and also just normalize it. Start to talk about it. Use this burnout buddy agreement, just start to kind of bring it into the vernacular of the company. I think you'll be very surprised at how receptive, and by the way, how many of your colleagues may be feeling this burn, particularly because of and due to the pandemic. You have people that are working from home, that are raising children, that are schooling children, that are, I mean, it's unbelievable what I am observing, and I'm lucky my baby is 19, but for working parents right now, we are headed for some kind of, I hate to sound doom and gloom, but potentially a burnout disaster if we do not start to run some interventions on ourselves and on our teams.
And I think that's a great point. And actually the follow-up question to that, sort of setting boundaries. So Jennifer's asking, how do you have any advice or tactics for setting personal boundaries at work when you're the overperformer and you're kind of the one that tends to be that dumping ground for everybody's work because they know you're the workhorse that's going to accomplish the task?
Yeah, so setting boundaries is, my gosh, that's a whole nother webinar that I could do on, delegation and saying no, and particularly for PR people that are racehorses. I used to call those people the racehorses, they just want to run, but even racehorses need time to rest and to eat grass and do whatever horses do, right? And so for you, it could be starting by leading by example. So really resisting the urge to be on 24/7 is a start. And I would say start small. If you're used to like, hey, I work till 11 at night, I look at my phone right before bed. And if I have something to answer, I'll do it. Maybe stop that 10:30 to 11 window. And, because you're not going to change yourself overnight. And for me, I know that to be the case. It almost took me to just completely crash. I guess, I don't know if it was a nervous breakdown or what the heck happened, but, don't let that happen to you. But some of the boundaries could be, okay, great, Bob, you'd like for me to do this. And Sarah, you'd like for me to do this. And so it's, okay, well, how do we set the priorities? So just asking a question, which one of these tasks is a real priority? Which one should come first? And sometimes you don't even have to ask the question. You can say, well, gosh, if I'm, the Stephen Covey quadrant of urgent and important, and resist. Here's my number one advice on this. Just because the request came in the most recent does not mean it's the most important thing on your to-do list. And sometimes that's what happens, particularly the boss or the bigger cheese will come in and say, oh, we need to do this. And it's like, oh, that's the most recent request. That's the most senior person. It must be the most important. And so sometimes it's just asking a question saying, oh, okay, yeah, oh, great. I can absolutely do that. I'm working on this other 3 things. Which do you think is more important, right? But just because it's the most recent doesn't make it the most important.
I think that's great advice. I think we all tend to do that, the first thing in the inbox, and I got to do this now so I don't forget and prioritize it above things. One thing that I actually did, and it wasn't sort of a way to say, it was kind of a boundary that I put up when we were locked at home still. The sheer volume of email that you receive was just overwhelming. And I had a big project I was working on. I actually put my out of office up on my email and said, I'll get to you when I get to you. I am working on something. And my boss actually called me for something else. And he said, I saw you're out of office. I love it. I think I'm going to do something similar, just to sort of let people know, like, yes, I'm working, but your priority is not necessarily my priority at the time.
Yep, that's 100% accurate. And I will say the emotional climate of the organization and its culture is created and sustained by the leaders, right? So depending on where you are in the echelon of your organization, but if you are a leader near the top or of your group, you're the one that's setting the tone for all of those people that work underneath you. And I worked, a lot. Like I said, my whole identity, everything was involved in my company. It wasn't until I left that I realized, I'm like, wow, people really don't think about work all the time. I didn't really understand it. So yes, I think that's a great technique, Jamie. And, people in Slack and stuff are using their do not disturb, between XYZ hours, or if you're, I don't know, working on a big project. I know for media relations people who may want to be able to pitch and work with the media in the morning when they're freshest, just I'm going to block that. I'm going to block that time right now as sacred, 9 to 10 or whatever every morning. And, you're going to have to get support. You can't just start blocking it but you're going to have to get support, but recognizing that really starts at the top of whatever the group or division is.
Sure. And so going back to sort of that emotional connection, Lisa says burnout, obviously, it affects your overall outlook, right? She's sensing that it's difficult to sort of set pessimism aside because you're sort of emotionally drained and sort of down, especially if you don't feel like there are a lot of options, whether it's lack of funds or the type of job you're in. She was wondering if you had any advice on how to replenish your optimism over time, especially in a sustained time like this.
Yeah, I think, well, first and foremost, and for me, I loved this time in an agency in particular, and that was with the relationships that I held. And so I am a little bit, I think I'm much better now because I've had years of coach training to be more optimistic. But I do think I'm a little pre-wired to be more of a person that's kind of a glass half empty person. So I would always surround myself at work with people who were the glass half full people. And you know who those people are. You're like, oh my gosh, why are you so optimistic? This is terrible. We're never going to get this job done, And so I would really make it a point. And remember how we talked about the time tracker? When you do that, you're like, this person I think might be my glass half full person, scheduling a regular, rhythm or a cadence with them, I think can really, really, really help. And then, I think just because you're in a job, right? It doesn't mean that you have to give up learning something new or trying something new. And I know this is going to be like, how does this relate to optimism? But it really does, because it can bolster your opinion or your self-esteem of yourself and your ability to get something done. And so, I don't know if you guys remember, like the woodworking, making the wood signs and all that was really kind of hot there for a while. I remember doing that going, wow, look at this. I made something. I don't consider myself crafty, but I really found that helped me build my optimism at work. Does that even make sense? It's the first time I've said that, but
I think so. You're kind of learning a new skill and, opening up a different part that you're like, yeah, I am good at this. It's not all work all the time.
Yeah. And then the other thing would be, and hopefully you're connected to the vision and the mission and the purpose of your company. You know, and sometimes revisiting that is so important. You know, come back to why am I here? If it's just for money and feeding your family, that's not going to get it done. To be
Sure.
optimistic, right? You're going to have to really connect to something that's a higher power, like Simon Sinek, the power of why, or whatever. I also think that would really help with optimism.
All right, well, thank you. It looks like Jennifer asks, is there any way to share a link to the DISC assessment that you talked about?
Yes, I can share that, and the VIA, I have the VIA handy, I believe. Give me just a second here.
Sure.
There is, if you just do a search on free disc, you definitely will find that. There's a free one. It's not as good. The one that I offer is, I think, you know, I charge $45 for it. It's a really a good one. But I'll drop this into the chat for character strengths. I don't have the free disc link right now. And for some reason I'm only, oh, there we go, and attendees. There is the character strengths, which will give you your top 5 signature strengths. And try not to look at the bottom strengths. I want you to look at the top strengths and figure out how your strengths can help you with burnout, optimism, whatever it is that you're looking to achieve.
Great. Well, I think that takes us to about 1:30, and as we've gotten through all the questions. So
Wonderful.
it was
I
awesome
love the gift of time.
Yes.
Go to the bathroom, take care of yourself. If you haven't eaten, please, good God, go grab a snack before your next call in 3 minutes.
Well, just want to thank you so much, Janet. I think, you know, really relevant information wherever you might be in your personal journey. Just a really great kind of overview and just better understanding. I think we're all looking for tools and sort of some guidance and how to deal with kind of the current environment and beyond, and just a really intense industry that we work in. So want to thank you so much for your time, for your insight, for sharing your kind of vulnerability and wisdom with our PRSA members, and appreciate your time. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Namaste. Have a great day.
You too. Take care.